Have you ever had someone talk to you like you weren't even human? Like you were just an obstacle standing between them and what they wanted? The kind of moment where you're smiling on the outside, but inside your chest feels tight, your jaw locks, and you can actually feel heat creeping up your neck. Because that's exactly where I was, standing behind a retail counter, being called stupid by a man old enough to know better. And while he thought the worst thing that could happen was having to buy a more expensive speaker, I quietly decided something else. I decided that if he wanted to disrespect me, I'd make sure returning that speaker would be one of the most frustrating experiences of his life. If you've ever worked retail, food service, call centers, or any job where customers think their money gives them permission to humiliate you, hit the like button right now. Subscribe if you enjoy slow, legal, emotionally satisfying revenge stories. Because this one proves you don't need to yell, threaten, or break rules to win. Sometimes, the best revenge is patient, silent, and perfectly timed. I've worked retail for 3 years, and people who haven't done it never really understand what it does to you. At first, you take everything personally. Every complaint feels like an attack. Every rude comment follows you home. But over time, something changes. You develop this strange emotional callus. You learn how to smile while being insulted. You learn how to apologize for policies you didn't create, shortages you didn't cause, and problems you can't fix. You learn how to swallow your pride, because rent still has to be paid and bills don't care about your dignity. Retail teaches you that most people don't see you. They see a uniform, a name tag, a function. You're not a person to them, you're a button they press to get what they want. And most days, you accept that. You clock in, you do your job, and you clock out. But every once in a while, someone crosses a line so casually, so confidently, that it sticks with you long after the shift ends. That day was a Tuesday, slow enough that time seemed to drag. The store was quiet except for the low hum of lights and distant music looping for the 100th time. My shift had been uneventful, the kind where you're counting minutes instead of customers. And then he walked in. He was middle-aged, dressed like someone who wanted to look important without actually being important. Business casual, clean shoes, stiff posture. His face carried that permanent look of irritation, like the world owed him something and kept forgetting to pay up. He didn't glance around the store or browse the shelves. He walked straight toward the counter with purpose, like he'd already decided this visit was going to be unpleasant. Before I even greeted him, I could tell he was already annoyed, not because of anything I'd done. He walked in angry, and I was just the nearest outlet. When he finally spoke, his tone wasn't curious or polite. It was demanding. "I'm looking for the X-Series Bluetooth speaker," he said, tapping the counter with his finger. "It's on sale." I pulled it up on the system, already suspecting the answer. The sale had been aggressive. Sure enough, the screen confirmed it, sold out. Not just our location, but every nearby store as well. My stomach sank slightly, not because of the shortage, but because I knew what was coming next. I took a breath, adjusted my posture, and switched into customer service mode. Calm voice, neutral expression, no defensiveness. "I'm really sorry, sir. That model sold out pretty quickly. I can check other stores farther away, or I can order it online for you at the same sale price and have it shipped to your address." They were reasonable options, helpful options, the kind of thing most customers would appreciate. He didn't. He laughed, short and sharp, like I'd just said something incredibly stupid. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound condescending instead of loud, and said, "Are you stupid? Just check the back." The word hit harder than I expected, not because it was creative, but because it was unnecessary. There was no frustration in his voice, just contempt, like he genuinely believed I was incapable of understanding something as simple as inventory. I felt my face heat up instantly. My jaw tightened so hard it almost hurt. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. But my training kicked in before my emotions could. Years of swallowing reactions paid off in that moment. I smiled, a perfect retail smile, calm, polite, empty. "Of course, sir," I said evenly. "I'll check the back for you." I turned and walked away, feeling his eyes on me, feeling the weight of that word echo in my head with every step. The stockroom was quiet, stacked high with boxes, smelling faintly of cardboard and dust. The hum of the lights felt louder back there, like it was amplifying my thoughts. I didn't start searching. I didn't pretend to look. I just stood there. 3 minutes. Not pacing. Not raging. Just breathing. I replayed the interaction in my head. The tone, the word, the way he'd said it so casually. Like he'd used it 100 times before on people who couldn't fight back. I thought about how easy it would be to snap. To go get a manager, to escalate things and turn it into a scene. And then I realized something. Reacting would give him control. Staying calm would give me options. I let the anger settle into something colder, something quieter. By the time I walked back out, I was calm again. "I'm sorry, sir," I said, meeting his eyes. "We don't have any in the back either." He didn't apologize. He didn't even acknowledge that I'd gone out of my way to check. He sighed loudly, shaking his head like I'd personally failed him. Then turned to the shelf and grabbed another speaker, bigger, more expensive. Clearly not what he wanted, but close enough. He placed it on the counter without a word. I rang it up while he stared at his phone, irritation radiating off him. As the scanner beeped and the price popped up, I noticed his expression tighten slightly. He was paying more than he planned. And suddenly, the power dynamic shifted. As I reached for the receipt, something inside me settled. Because in that moment, I realized something he didn't. The interaction wasn't over. Not even close. As I rang up the speaker, I noticed the exact moment his irritation turned into resignation. The price was higher than he wanted, and he knew it. His shoulders stiffened, his lips pressed together, and he exhaled through his nose, like this was just another small injustice the world had personally delivered to him. He didn't look at me, didn't ask questions, didn't say a word. He just stood there, tapping his card impatiently against the counter as if that might make the process go faster. And that silence told me something important. He wasn't done being annoyed. He was storing it for later. Retail teaches you to read people quickly. You learn who's going to complain, who's going to ask for a manager, and who's going to be back in a few days pretending nothing happened, while demanding a refund. This guy fell cleanly into the third category. He was the type who would go home, think about the interaction, decide he'd overpaid, and come back ready to unload his frustration on the next employee unlucky enough to be scheduled. I'd seen it dozens of times before. Our store's return policy was simple on paper but brutal in practice. With a receipt, returns were fast. Scan, refund, done. Without one, it became a process. Managers had to be involved. An ID had to be scanned. The refund became store credit only. Questions were asked. Time was wasted. Customers hated it. They especially hated it when they were already annoyed. And every single word of that policy floated calmly through my head as I finished the transaction. The printer whirred softly as the receipt came out. A thin strip of paper, innocent looking, most customers barely glanced at it. They crumpled it, shoved it in a pocket, or left it in the bag without thinking. But I knew better. I knew exactly how much power that little piece of paper held. And as I picked it up, I felt something click into place. This wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. My hands moved calmly, deliberately. I folded the receipt once, then again, and again, smaller, tighter, until it was barely bigger than a postage stamp. I could feel my heartbeat slow as I worked, every fold neat and intentional. This wasn't about humiliation or public embarrassment. This was about inconvenience, controlled, legal, invisible. I placed the speaker into the bag carefully, then tucked the tiny folded receipt deep into the plastic near the seam. I folded the bag over and taped it shut, pressing the tape firmly so it bonded with the plastic. Then I took a second bag, placed the first one inside it, and sealed that one too. More tape, more pressure. I slid the receipt perfectly between the layers where the tape met the plastic, embedding it just enough that finding it later would require effort. Real effort. All the while, he stood there scrolling on his phone, completely unaware. To him, this was just another transaction. Another forgettable interaction with someone he'd already dismissed as stupid. He didn't see the care I put into bagging his purchase. He didn't notice how methodical my movements were. He didn't question why I was using so much tape. He just wanted to leave. And that was the best part. I handed him the bag with a polite smile and the same calm tone I'd used all day. "Enjoy your speaker, sir." He took it without looking at me, gave a short nod, and walked out of the store. No apology. No thank you. Just irritation carried out the door. As the automatic doors closed behind him, I felt something I hadn't felt all day, relief, not because he was gone, but because I knew something he didn't. He thought the interaction was over. He thought he'd won by getting his way, even if it cost him more money. He had no idea that if he came back, angry and ready to return that speaker, his frustration would be waiting for him, layered, sticky, folded tight into a problem he created himself. I didn't break a rule. I didn't lie. I didn't raise my voice or insult him back. I just let policy do the work for me. And as I went back to my station, the store felt quieter than before, like the air itself had settled. Because sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't loud. It's patient, and it waits. The funny thing about quiet revenge is that most of it happens when you're not even there to witness it. After he walked out of the store, my shift continued like nothing special had happened. More customers came in, more questions, more smiles. But in the back of my mind, I kept replaying a single image over and over again, him standing at his kitchen counter, opening that bag, realizing the speaker wasn't what he wanted after all. Because buyers like him always regret it later. Maybe it happened that same night. Maybe he got home, opened the box, and realized the sound wasn't as good as the one he originally wanted. Maybe it was too bulky, too complicated. Or maybe he just cooled off enough to remember he'd paid more than he planned. People like him don't forget that kind of thing. They stew on it. They replay the moment in their heads until annoyance turns into certainty. Certainty that they were wronged. Certainty that they deserved better. Certainty that returning it would fix everything. I imagined him deciding to return it. The confidence. The entitlement. The way he'd walk back into the store already irritated. Receipt forgotten but unconcerned. Because in his mind returns were simple. Because they always had been. He probably assumed he'd tossed the bag on the counter, say he changed his mind, and be out the door in 5 minutes with his money back. That's how life usually worked for him. Until it didn't. I could see it clearly. Him standing at the counter again, placing the speaker down with that same impatient energy, telling whoever was working that day he wanted a return. I imagined the employee asking politely, "Do you have the receipt?" And that's when the first crack would appear. The pause, the brief patting of pockets, the slight frown, because he wouldn't have it in his wallet. He wouldn't have it loose in the bag either. That's when he'd start digging. He'd pull the speaker out of the bag first, confident at first, then slower. He checked the bottom, the sides, inside the box. He'd shake the bag slightly, annoyed but still calm. Maybe he'd laugh and say something like, "It's in there somewhere." But the longer he searched, the quieter he'd get, because the bag wouldn't give anything up easily. I imagined him peeling at the tape, expecting it to come off cleanly, only for it to stretch and stick and tear the plastic. The sound alone would irritate him. That sharp ripping noise, the resistance. The way cheap tape never comes off in one clean strip. He'd start pulling harder now, the bag crinkling loudly under his fingers, drawing attention from the people behind him in line. Still no receipt. That's when frustration would start to creep in. Not explosive yet, just that tight jaw, that exhale through the nose. He'd dig deeper, fingers sticking slightly to the adhesive residue, pulling the plastic apart layer by layer. Maybe the employee would offer to help. Maybe they'd stand there awkwardly, waiting. Either way, he'd feel it. That shift, the subtle loss of control. Eventually, he'd find it. Or part of it. That tiny, crumpled square of paper wedged between plastic and tape. Half stuck, half hidden. Like it didn't want to be found. He'd have to pry it loose, scraping at the adhesive. Careful not to rip it completely. By the time it came free, it wouldn't look like a receipt anymore. It would look like evidence pulled from a crime scene. And even then, it wouldn't be over. Because receipts like that don't skin easily, wrinkled, folded too many times, smudged with adhesive. The barcode might not read on the first try, or the second, or the third. The employee would have to manually enter numbers, call a manager, ask questions. Time would stretch. The line behind him would grow. People would sigh, shift their weight, check their phones. Every second would add weight to his irritation. And if the receipt didn't scan at all, if one corner tore just enough to make it unreadable, then policy would take over. The same policy he'd never bothered to read. Manager involvement. ID required. Store credit only. More waiting. More explaining. More humiliation disguised as procedure. That's the thing about retail policies. They don't care how important you think you are. They don't care how much money you make. They apply equally to everyone, and when you're already angry, they feel personal. Like punishment. Like the world is pushing back. I never saw his face during that moment. I wasn't there. But I didn't need to be. I'd seen versions of it hundreds of times before. I knew the body language. The raised voice just enough to sound firm but not loud. The way frustration leaks out through clipped sentences and forced politeness. The way people like him hate being slowed down, hate being inconvenienced, hate feeling like they've lost control in public. And knowing that was enough, because while he was standing there, fighting plastic bags and tape and policy, I was somewhere else entirely, helping another customer, stocking shelves, living my life. He'd probably never thought about me again. He wouldn't connect the dots. He wouldn't realize the inconvenience was intentional. To him, it would just feel like bad luck. Like the universe was against him that day. But I would know. And that quiet knowledge settled deep in my chest, warm and steady. Not triumph exactly. Not joy, just balance. Because for once, the disrespect didn't disappear into nothing. It didn't get swallowed and forgotten. It transformed into something small, precise, and perfectly timed. Sometimes revenge isn't about being seen. It's about knowing that somewhere at the exact wrong moment, someone who treated you like nothing is finally feeling just a fraction of what they gave out so freely. By the time he finally reached the counter to return the speaker, the frustration would already be simmering just below the surface. He would tell himself to stay calm, that this was a simple return, that he was in the right. But irritation has a way of leaking out no matter how hard you try to contain it. It shows in the way you stand too close to the counter, in the way you place the box down a little harder than necessary, in the way your voice sounds clipped even when you're trying to be polite. He would say he wanted to return it. No apology, no explanation, just the expectation that the process would move quickly. The employee would ask for the receipt, and he would finally place that mangled, sticky square of paper on the counter like proof of suffering. At this point, he would already feel wronged, embarrassed, slowed down. The store, in his mind, would be failing him all over again. The scanner would beep, nothing. The employee would try again, adjusting the angle, smoothing the paper out as best they could. Still nothing. A pause would stretch between them, heavy and uncomfortable. The employee would glance at the screen, then back at him, and say the words that customers like him hate the most. "I'm sorry, it's not scanning." That's when his patience would finally crack. Not in a dramatic outburst, but in that sharp shift in tone. The way his voice would get louder without him realizing it. The way his words would come faster now, more defensive. He'd say he just bought it. He'd say he had the receipt. He'd say it shouldn't be this hard. And none of that would matter because policy doesn't respond to tone. It doesn't care how justified you feel. The employee would call for a manager. That moment, the wait, would be the worst part. Standing there while someone else is brought in. Feeling eyes on your back. Hearing the shuffle of the line behind you. Every second would feel like judgment. When the manager arrived, calm and professional, they'd repeat the same thing. The receipt was damaged. The system couldn't verify it automatically. And without verification, the return couldn't be processed as a normal refund. They would explain the alternative. Store credit only. ID required. A longer process. That's when the realization would hit him fully. This wasn't going to be quick. This wasn't going to be easy. And worst of all, this wasn't going to be on his terms. The man who walked into the store thinking he was in control would now be trapped in a process he couldn't speed up or bully his way through. He'd argue, not angrily at first, but firmly. He'd insist this was ridiculous. He'd say he had places to be. He'd say he'd never had this problem before. And the manager would nod, listen, and repeat the policy again, just as calmly. Because rules, when enforced politely, feel even more suffocating. Eventually, he'd comply. He always would. People like him hate losing more than they hate inconvenience. He'd pull out his ID with a sharp motion. He'd accept the store credit with visible resentment. Every step would feel like defeat. And by the time the transaction was finally done, his frustration would be complete. He'd leave the store not relieved, not satisfied, but simmering. The kind of anger that has nowhere to go. He wouldn't have a person to blame. Just a system. Just bad luck. Just a bad day that somehow kept getting worse. And I wouldn't be there to see any of it. That was the beauty of it. Because the revenge wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about watching him suffer in real time. It was about knowing that the same calm politeness he dismissed as stupidity had quietly outmaneuvered him, that the system he'd taken for granted had turned against him at the exact moment he least wanted resistance. Back at my store days later, I'd probably be ringing up another customer, smiling, doing my job like always. He might never return, or if he did, he'd never recognize me. He wouldn't remember my face. To him, I'd just be another retail worker, another forgettable obstacle. But I'd remember, because sometimes justice doesn't need witnesses. It just needs timing. And that day, timing was on my side. The thing about revenge like this is that it doesn't explode. It doesn't echo. It doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where everyone claps or where the antagonist realizes exactly what they did wrong. And maybe that's why it works. Because the satisfaction doesn't come from being seen. It comes from knowing that just once. The disrespect didn't disappear into thin air. I went home that day and didn't feel guilty. I didn't replay the insult over and over like I usually did after a bad interaction. The word stupid didn't stick to me the way it normally would have. It slid off. Because for the first time in a long time, I hadn't absorbed the impact alone. I hadn't swallowed it and carried it home. I'd redirected it, quietly, legally, permanently. Retail teaches you how powerless you are most of the time. You can't talk back. You can't defend yourself. You can't correct someone when they decide you're beneath them. You're expected to take it, smile, and move on. And most days, you do. But that doesn't mean the feeling disappears. It just gets stored away, building slowly, waiting for something to balance it out. That man will probably never know what he did. He'll never connect the frustration of that return to the way he spoke to me. In his mind, it'll just be another bad experience. Another reason to complain about customer service. Another story where he's the victim. And that's fine. Because the point was never to teach him a lesson. The point was to remind myself that I wasn't powerless. That even within the narrow boundaries of retail rules and policies, I still had agency. People like him assume kindness is weakness. They mistake politeness for stupidity. They think compliance means submission. But what they never realize is that systems are built by people. Policies exist for a reason. And when you push someone too far, sometimes the system is the sharpest tool they have. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't risk my job or my reputation. I didn't become the kind of person I hated dealing with. I just let the moment pass and set a small, invisible consequence in motion. One that would activate at the worst possible time. One that would linger just long enough to matter. And that's the part that still makes me smile. Because somewhere out there, a man who once called a stranger stupid stood at a counter, peeling tape, fighting plastic, waiting for a manager, feeling watched, slowed and powerless. He felt frustration without a target, anger without relief, a tiny fraction of the discomfort he handed out so casually. And I was nowhere near him. Sometimes revenge doesn't look like fire. Sometimes it looks like a folded receipt. Sometimes it's not about winning loudly, but about restoring balance quietly. And if you've ever been talked down to, dismissed, or made to feel small just for doing your job, then you already understand why this mattered. Because respect costs nothing. And when someone refuses to pay it, inconvenience is a perfectly fair alternative. If this story hit home, smash that like button and subscribe for more emotionally satisfying Reddit revenge stories just like this. Drop a comment and tell us what's the quietest revenge you've ever witnessed or secretly carried out. And remember, the calmest smile often hides the sharpest response.